It is 25 to 2 on Talk. Let's pick up on that story then. So the Tories are warning of a creeping blasphemy law. This is after the man that we've been discussing, Hamit Coskun, was fined for burning a Koran outside the Turkish consulate in London. He shouted anti-Islamic slurs and was convicted of a public order offence. Kemi Badenoch says it's putting Britain on the road to ruin. Robert Jenrick calling it two-tier justice. In a moment, Chris Doyle, KC, barrister, writer and broadcaster, can shine some light on the legalities of all of this. But first, Andrew Doyle, author of The End of Woke, and regularly speaks out on these kind of issues as well. Andrew, good afternoon to you. So blasphemy by the back door, the Tories are calling it, are they right?
They're exactly right. I mean, let's not forget that this guy, Hamit Coskun, he's a guy who was raised in Turkey. His mother's family were killed during the Armenian genocide. He has a lot of reasons to dislike Islam as a belief system, and he's every right to express that view. And of course, in a free society, no belief system can possibly be ring-fenced from criticism, ridicule, and even hatred. If you hate a belief system, you should be allowed to say it. That's what it means to be free. Now, you might say that burning a copy of the Quran is needlessly provocative. It's not something I would do. It's not something I even approve of. I don't like the image of burning books. It leaves a very bad taste in my mouth. That form of protest I don't like. However, it is a form of peaceful protest. He wasn't harming anyone. He was disposing of a copy of his own book that he had bought in the way that he deemed to be fit. And he did it in front of the Turkish consulate because, as he said explicitly, he wanted to protest Erdogan's government in Turkey, which he perceives to be an Islamist regime, which is laying the groundwork for further Islamist regimes. I mean, that's what he said explicitly. Yeah. Well, the judge said in the ruling that the part of his decision was based on the fact that he'd chosen that location. Now, he interpreted that as therefore being deliberately designed to upset Muslims who he knew would be there. But on the contrary, where else would you want to protest against the Turkish government than outside the Turkish consulate? It seems to me that that's the ideal place to stage a peaceful protest. But the most disturbing element of this, I think, is the fact that this man was attacked by a knife-wielding maniac who stabbed him. And then as he was on the floor, he was kicked by a passing delivery driver. Yeah. Those two individuals have not yet faced trial. I know they will do. But as yet, this one's been very much rushed through. Apparently the words are the more frightening thing. But even worse than that, the judge in this case said, we know that your protest was disorderly and likely to stir disordered behaviour because you were attacked twice. So in other words, the attacks are taken as proof that this was stirring up violence. That, to me, is insane. Yeah, and
I kind of vaguely... I said yesterday, I mean, I can understand if he was done for littering, to be honest, because no one would assume there was a bit of debris after you set fire to something. And if you got a 50 quid fine from the local council for not clearing it up, I could almost get my head around that. I can just about get my head around, public disorder and all of that stuff. But the inclusion of the word religiously is the disturbing bit for me, Andrew. The fact that this has clearly been surrounded by that element and has become the centrepiece of this, that it's a religious crime. And there's no, you can't dress that up in any other way.
No, the key distinguishing feature in the judge's ruling that he was distinguishing between whether Coskun was motivated by hatred towards Islam, which the judge conceded was perfectly legal, or whether it was motivated towards animosity towards Muslims themselves, the people who follow Islam. Now, the defendant made clear that he had no problem with individual Muslims, that he was talking about the faith, the belief system, and ultimately the judge didn't believe him. So that's really the sticking point. But the point is that this charge, this whole thing has been brought about because of the desecration of a holy book. I mean, let's not forget, we saw Tahir Ali stand up in Parliament and say that he wanted to see this kind of act, desecration of holy books, criminalised. He was calling for a blasphemy law in Parliament. That's a member of Parliament calling for that law. And let's not also forget that when the Crown Prosecution Service initially issued this charge, they wanted to charge him with intent to cause harassment, alarm or distress against the religious institution of Islam. Yeah. That's the words that the Crown Prosecution Service put in their charge. They were forced to reword it because there is no law that does. In other words, the Crown Prosecution Service were effectively inventing a blasphemy law.
Yeah, that would have been unequivocally a blasphemy law, wouldn't it?
Well, the judge rejected that, and it was rejected, and that to me, but that points to the real problem here, and the real problem here is institutional capture. We have the police services, the Crown Prosecution Service, and even elements of the judiciary are captured by this intersectional, multicultural ideology. And so, therefore, one of the things that activists do when they're in positions of power is they work around the law. Okay, we've seen it with Stonewall. Stonewall have been misrepresenting the equality law for years, the Equality Act, which is why we had to have this ruling in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Activists misrepresent the law. The Crown Prosecution Service here seemingly invented a kind of law. Well, we've had it many, many times before, actually. This is not the first time this has happened. Remember that when Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions, he had the wording changed so that the Crown Prosecution Service no longer talks about complainants, but talks about victims. That's a very significant linguistic shift, because it means that we're now talking about bypassing due process, the assumption of guilt. Any of these kind of activist maneuvers within these major and significant bodies pose a genuine threat. I mean, another example, after the Jimmy Savile scandal, the Crown Prosecution Service was absolutely determined to make sure we had as many convictions as possible when it came to sexual offence charges. Pressure, unofficial pressure maybe, but pressure was put upon the police and the prosecutors to do so. So much so that in 2018 it was revealed that in over 40 cases, police and prosecutors had withheld evidence that would have exonerated individuals accused of sexual assault because they wanted to ramp up the number of prosecutions. In other words, they knew that these men were innocent. We're talking about over 40 lives would have been ruined. They knew they were innocent, and they prioritized the ideological goal of the CPS over justice. So it's a very serious thing, this. When activists take control in this way, we don't have a blasphemy law in this country. We haven't had one since 2008. But it looks very much as though the activists within the system are determined to reinstate it one way or another. If Parliament won't do it, then they sure as hell will find a way.
Do you think, Andrew, that this is... Because obviously, if you look online, and it's advisable for none of us to live our life through the conduit of social media, but, we look every now and again, whether it's sitting on a train, laying in bed, and depending on what somebody's said, if you disagree with it, you get very angry, and then, of course, we've all started to write a response and then deleted it when we thought better. But I wonder... There is a theory, that this is a kind of an organised setup. Everything you've just described it's a framework that has been almost beautiful. You could draw the kind of the equivalent of the family tree and link it all up, from the Attorney General, the Prime Minister, the law courts here, the magistrates. Somebody had a secret word. Obviously, it didn't come down directly from Keir, but it came from all of these theories. And I don't think that is the case. I mean, I think that would be the stuff of, sort of crazy, Netflix-y kind of dramas. However, you are sort of... It's a bit like quoting Orwell, isn't it? You don't want to do it, but sometimes you're sort of forced into going, I had to do it in the end. And because it does look like that. And I just wonder whether there's a sort of a nudge theory going on where people don't even realise they're part of it, that they just go down that path and agree or err on the side of a certain ruling because they think it's the thing to do.
It looks very much like that, but I would really urge people not to go down these conspiratorial routes. I mean, you're going back to this idea of the long march through the institutions, which was an idea that was put to paper. It's not something that was invented. People thought that, we could gradually infiltrate the major institutions, the major establishments, and seize power. But it didn't really happen like that. I mean, it's a combination of many things, but really a lot of it's to do with fashion, and a lot of it's to do with changing trends, and that there is now among the elites, the more powerful in society, a tendency to fall into line with these ideological views for all sorts of reasons. It's not that they're all gathered in secret saying, how can we destroy free speech in this country? Let's implement this, let's implement that. It's just that those in positions of power tend to be the kind of people who fall in lockstep with this activist worldview. And this goes right back to, obviously, there were problems within the police with the Macpherson report when you go back to the horrible murder of Stephen Lawrence, and people wanted to do something, but nothing quite happened. It took many years before the College of Policing introduced their idea of non-crime hate incidents and the idea of recording racist incidents rather than racist crimes. And so it's been a gradual development. But, College of Policing is a very good example. They introduced non-crime hate incidents in 2015, but they didn't have a government mandate to do so.
No.
And that was many, many years after Stephen Lawrence. This was nothing to do with that. They just did it. And the guy who was running the College of Policing at the time had just won the year before Stonewall's top award. Now, I'm not saying causality is present there, but what I'm saying is there's an activist mindset.
Yes, it's in the Venn diagram, isn't it?
At the upper echelons, right? So I think what we have to do, and it's very hard because, it's all very well for the Tories now to say this is a backdoor blasphemy law. They've done nothing to stop it, though.
100%.
They were in power for 14 years. Why do we have, at the moment, we have hate speech laws in this country, which should never exist. We have laws on our statute books, codified in the Communications Act and the Public Order Act and the Malicious Communications Act,
Yep.
which effectively mean that you can be sent down for offensive words. I mean, we have thousands and thousands of people arrested every year in this country for offensive speech. The Communications Act stipulates that if you post something online that is grossly offensive, that's the words, grossly offensive, you can be arrested for that and you can be prosecuted. Yeah. What does that even mean? No one can define it. Someone in Parliament, the government, of one form or another, has to say, we can't have nebulous terms like grossly offensive on the statute books. They have to be scrapped. They also have to go back to the quangos like the College of Policing. They have to go back to the Crown Prosecution Service. They have to strip out activist influence in the judiciary. It's not an easy thing. And it's going to take a long time because it took a long time to embed itself in there. But it has to be done if we want to be living in a free society.
Listen, Andrew, it's always great to speak with you on these issues. Andrew Doyle, author of The End of Woke, by the way. I fear he might be writing a few volumes of that. Great to have Andrew on with us. Let's get a word on the legal side of this. Chris Doyle, KC, barrister, writer and broadcaster. Afternoon to you, Chris. So the Tories are calling it blasphemy by the back door. Do you recognise that?
Yes, I do. I mean, the reason we abolished blasphemy a few years back, as you've just heard, is because it only applied to the Christian faith and the established faith and only protected one religion. So understandably, there was a sensible decision taken that in a country that has many religions, you can't have a blasphemy law for one, but not for the others. So it was abolished altogether. And the problem we have, and I agree with almost everything that your last contributor, Andrew Doyle, had to say, the problem we have is that we have too many criminal laws that criminalise behaviour, which is fundamentally not suitable for the criminal justice process, like causing someone's offence or causing someone distress because, they're distressed because you strongly disagree with them and they find that very upsetting. Well, fundamentally, it should be first and foremost, you have the right to say whatever you like, provided you do it peacefully and you protest peacefully. And you should be able to do it and say it wherever you like, including outside the embassy of a foreign government, which may not like it and may crack down on its own citizens who protest in their own country. But in this country, you should be allowed to burn the Koran, you should be able to burn Lord of the Rings or any other book you want that you've bought and paid for, and no police officer should be able to stop you.
Yeah. What's the bit that got me here? I mean, if somebody wants to say, I said to Andrew, it's more of a littering offence than anything as far as I can see it. But nonetheless, I was being slightly sort of smart saying that. But my point is that the public disorder aspect of this, aggravated public order offence, all right, let's say, OK, he was kicking off. He was clearly wanted to make a scene. Somebody gave him a smack and, that proves the point that it was public disorder. But what's the inclusion of the religiously element going on here, Chris? Why do you sense that, and Andrew Doyle did say that this was downgraded, from what it originally could have been, but why do we need that included?
Well, I don't think we do. The reason it's included, I think it's important for people to understand that the judge in this case was applying the law of the land, which was decided by Parliament. It's not the judge's fault. There's nothing woke about the judge. The judge has simply applied the law of the land very, very strictly and accurately. What the problem is, the law's wrong. But the answer to your question is that some years ago, someone had the bright idea to use the words racially and religiously aggravated and use them as to create sort of separate crimes in numerous different categories, of which the Public Order Act is the most obvious. So, we've always had, well, for many, many years, we've had a Public Order Act. It goes back to 1986, and it criminalised, the idea of it was to criminalise situations where there's a sense of fear and violence created by people behaving in a way that it isn't acceptable and which genuinely puts the public in some sort of fear, and genuine and real substantial fear. Now it's being used simply to attack people, arrest people for posting on Twitter in a way that people find offensive. And once you head down that road there's not going to be many police left to investigate burglary or robbery or rape because they're just going to be too tied up on Twitter all day.
Yeah, thousands of them, as it turns out. Chris, thank you as ever. Very thorough stuff from Chris Doyle, KC, barrister. Is there anyone that thinks all of this stuff is kind of OK? Is it blasphemy by the back door? Although, as Chris was saying there, the judge simply implemented, or the district judge in this case implemented the law of the land. It was almost that simple.